Welcome to EKU Center for Student Accessibility virtual tour of our office featuring your host, me, Lee Griesheimer. What I'm going to do today is kind of walk you through the three items we need for students to register for the Center for Student Accessibility. Again, my name is Lee Griesheimer. I'm an academic success coordinator. I've been in this position for about 10 years. I mostly work with students on a weekly basis, providing coaching. I also assess documentation to determine appropriate accommodations. So again, we're going to walk through the three things students need to do to register for services. And I'm going to take you to our website, which is accessibility.eku.edu. The first step in the process is to apply for services. So I'm scrolling down, and on the left, you'll see a button, online application. I am going to hit this button, and it's a fillable form. Pretty straightforward. I'm just going to scroll down a little bit so we can look at a few items. Not all of these may be applicable to you, including this one. Do you work with vocational rehabilitation? Voc Rehab is a federal organization. It manifests a little bit differently in each state. I highly recommend it. In Kentucky, we have a wonderful relationship with vocational rehabilitation, and it's a great program, and they provide a lot of support to transitioning students. So we'll keep going down through the application. Did you receive academic accommodations in high school? That's another question to pay attention to. And I'm going to the last question, which I hope you will take the time to carefully consider. How does your disability create barriers, challenges as a college student in class and or with housing? From what accommodations would you benefit for an equalizing opportunity? So our guidelines for post-secondary education fall under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the American Disabilities Act. Accommodations manifest a little bit differently in college than they did in K through 12, which was covered under a different law. So we really want you to think about this question, carefully consider what were the most important accommodations that important accommodations that you received in high school. Take a minute to answer that. So we're going to go back to the home page, and we will continue with the second step in the process, which is documentation. We have two guidelines to help students with submitting documentation. So if you go to this Applying for Services tab, our first guidelines are here, and they are for students with mental health or medical conditions. Often, this is the area where students have the most questions. So if you have a mental health or medical professional that you have a long-standing relationship with, we ask that they use their letterhead and write us a letter, just basically covering these points. We need the diagnosis, date first diagnosed, the severity of the condition, how they determined the diagnosis, what tests and measurements they used to determine the diagnosis. And most importantly, we need their recommendations and the implications from the diagnosis, especially the implications that manifest in an academic setting or in a housing setting. So that is the documentation guidelines for mental health and medical conditions. We also have a learning differences documentation guidelines page. So this is for people diagnosed with a specific learning disorder. Generally, this is usually a learning disorder in reading, also known as dyslexia, or specific learning disorder in math. A lot of folks that have this diagnosis received it through their school, and they also received reevaluations every 3 years through their school system. So we would need the most recent reevaluation. It's either called a psychological evaluation or a psychosocial evaluation. It generally includes several achievement tests, and then the diagnosis, which would be specific learning disorder in math or reading, and then a summary with the recommendations. So if you have any questions about your documentation, the best thing to do is basically just send us your documentation. Send it to this website, which you can find at the bottom of the page, bottom left-hand corner. It's our office inbox. It's accessibility@eku.edu. We will get it, and we can let you know if the documentation is appropriate to receive services or if we need more. Generally, if we need more, we will provide some provisional accommodations until we get the supplemental things that we need. So the third step in the process to becoming registered with our office is to schedule an intake appointment. And again, to do that, you can email our accessibility@eku.edu inbox, or you can communicate with one of our 3 staff members, Dr. Koger, the director, myself, Lee Griesheimer, or my colleague, Jessica Harris Hunt. Our email addresses are also on the website. I hope that clarified some things, and we look very much forward to seeing you all in person in August, and just email us with any questions. Thank you. Bye.